Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. The first few months of the Trump administration have proven not just how willing much of America was to embrace and celebrate fascism, but how crucial careful, clear-eyed, and thoughtful reporting and analysis are to building and sustaining a resistance movement. Few publications have been as essential in this moment as Liberal Currents, which has consistently brought deep understanding, a sense of urgency, and a commitment to the necessary practical steps of defending liberal institutions and values. That's why I'm delighted to have on today the founder and editor-in-chief of Liberal Currents, Adam Gurri. We talk about the intellectual environment, the virtues of being well-informed while not overwhelmed, and what political science has to say about whether Trump can succeed in his quest to become a dictator. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported show. If you'd like to listen to episodes uninterrupted by ads from our sponsors, you can become a supporter. You'll get my newsletter ad-free as well. To learn more, head to www.reimaginingliberty.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Adam. What can liberals be doing in this moment?
That's the question that everyone has, right? Lots of people talking about what's wrong, how it can go from here, and what maybe some other people should be doing, what Democrats should be doing, or what courts should be doing. But what can any of us be doing? And I think the question is that depends on who you are. There are some things that literally anyone can do. You can support media that is actually oppositional to the administration. And that matters more than people think, which we can talk about if you like. But there's not nearly enough of it, and it's not nearly as well supported as it should be, in my opinion. So that's one thing anyone can do. Another thing you can do is just talk with other people. So we all there's a lack of trust in media. There is political polarization such that people in your life who are strong Republican partisans might not listen to you, but not everyone is a strong Republican partisan. And even if they're partisan, maybe they're not strong, and then there's just people who aren't very attached to any party. And there might be people who just trust you personally. So just talking to them and meeting them where they are, not trying to be heavy-handed, but just thinking in terms of what does this person care about that personally. What is the one thing you can say to them today? Because there's so much going on that there's got to be one thing you can say to them on a given day that you are seeing them about what's going on. That's not accusatory or confrontational, but it's just making an observation about things that are going on that might shift their way of thinking. That's another thing you can be doing. Little things like that. Then it sort of depends on who you are. If you are in the law community right now, you need to do absolutely everything in your power to stop the bandwagoning to complying with these Trump executive orders against big law. You should be talking to your state bar about what actions they can take. You should be going to conferences and talking with other people in the community. If you're at a firm yourself, talk with the people in the firm, talk with the partners if you can. Engage people through any forums you have, because if the law community does not get its act together quick, we're not going to have a law community to speak of very soon. We're just going to have an appendage of the Trump administration. So that's one thing. There's sectoral things like that. Media is similar though. If you're in the media, you need to find your backbone. You need to find your plan B for if and when the Trump administration comes at you either indirectly through private lawsuits, which is something they've employed very aggressively since before he even went into office, since before he even won the election, something that's a little bit undercovered. But also, he's going very directly through executive orders and through other things to apply pressures to media companies. So if you're in the media industry, pushing everything in a more adversarial direction as much as you can, and finding ways to shore yourself up to prepare for the assault, because it will be coming, if you're of any size that matters. That's what you need to be doing. So again, there are things that we can all be doing depending on where we are, I would say. And my answer is everything that we can do, we should be doing. I think we've run a few pieces at Liberal Currents that are sort of this message told in very different angles. But the basic point I want to say is now is not the time to be thinking 3 moves ahead, never mind 12 moves ahead. Right now the disaster is upon us and we just have to do everything we can. You can't overcomplicate it. You've got to think about what you can do today, and maybe what you can do to protect yourself from the next, what one move ahead, the reaction from the administration. That's about it.
There's a lot in there, but a common theme running through it is pushing back on capitulation or not giving into the urge to capitulate. And we've seen a fair amount of it. You note the law firms giving in on these just patently unconstitutional executive orders and executive orders that those firms that have stood up to them, the federal government backs down relatively quickly. But this
Yeah.
has been another pattern that has emerged is everybody capitulates except for like one person, and then that one person gets left alone. And the people who capitulate, the administration keeps coming back at them, which is I mean, Trump is just a bully. That's his entire thing. And this is very much a bullying behavior, right? Like you pick out a bunch of victims, the ones that stand up to you, you just leave alone because they're not worth it. And the ones that back down, you just keep asking for their lunch money every single day because you know they'll give it to you. And it's really frustrating. But what I was thinking about as you were talking about that is how much of the capitulation we're seeing right now by the media, by law firms, by universities, by Democrats in Congress, who I live in Colorado, both of my senators have voted for almost every nominee that Trump has put up. They've been useless in fighting back against this. Is a result of there was this narrative coming out of the election of a mandate. His popularity ratings started higher than they had the first time around. They stayed higher than they were at any point. Even now, they're higher than at any point in his first presidency. But as we are recording this on April 11th, his approval ratings, his disapproval has finally ticked above 50%. His approval rating is down at 45. He is almost, if you compare the graph of where his approval ratings over his first term to his second term is now dipping to the point where it's going to be below where it was during his first at a similar time. Most of these polls are before the tariffs hit. The ones I saw this morning indicated things are even worse for him right now. Like the bottom seems to be falling out on his support, and the narrative about it was oversold to begin with. But I guess the question for you is, how much do you think this like bandwagoning of capitulation is a result of people just convincing themselves Trump is popular, so I have to go along with it? And so to what extent do you see this shifting when it becomes clear that no one except that hardcore 20 to 30% of Americans who are genuinely authoritarian actually likes the guy?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially from the Democrats, that's true. I don't know that that's true for like the law firms. With the law firms, they just face a basic reality that he's going to be president for the next 4 years. And my understanding is that many of the law firms that caved quickly have a large merger and acquisitions portfolio that is very vulnerable to the federal government taking action. So in there, it's really more that Trump has clearly shown that th the gloves are off and they're gonna do anything, to get their way. Mergers and acquisitions is a real easy pain point. I know for a fact that, uh, there was reporting anyway, that X, formerly Twitter, approached, uh, WPP, the big ad agency, because they just had a big merger, essentially saying to them, "Hey, if you don't start advertising with us again, we're gonna put in a word and your merger's not gonna go through." Um, so, that's a point of real vulnerability, there. But for Democrats, I do think at first, especially in like December, the rhetoric used in December and some of the things that you saw in the first 6 weeks, say, um, It was just a perception that Trump actually was popular. And this was like the like with everything with Trump, it's grading on a curve. It's it's not actually that it was a huge victory. It's like, well, he actually won the popular vote this time. That means he's popular. I mean, no, every other president except for the first time with Bush, won the popular vote too, but sometimes they won it closely, which is what happened this time. So I'd say it's some of it. It's certainly a part of it. Yeah.
Some of the things that you mentioned, though, feel small, which is not to downplay like the importance of doing them, like talking with Republican supporting friends about the impacts. Um, but they feel like the kind of things that we ought to be doing all the time
Sure.
anyway.
Yeah.
So for any
Sure.
presidency, you ought to be trying to persuade people and you ought to be pointing out areas where you think like what they voted for is harming them. Like that's part of political persuasion, no matter which side you're on. That's just how it works. And you should be doing that. With the media should always exist in opposition to power. Like
It should.
that should be its basic, this has been, I think, the main failure of elite media is
Yeah.
the utterly reprehensible White House Correspondents' Dinner. The like, we want to rub elbows with power instead of existing in opposition, speaking truth to, challenging, and just pissing off power.
Yeah.
But the, when you said spend money on opposition media, I can imagine someone saying, well, but the richest newspaper in the world, or in the United States, the New York Times, is Democratic leaning and has been publishing articles in opposition to Trump. It doesn't appear to be at least a pro-Trump paper. The Washington Post, who knows with Bezos, but it certainly isn't. It isn't Newsmax or Fox News. The major news networks are not, like the NBC Nightly News is not a pro-Trump. And so it seems like the richest media seems to already be in opposition.
Yeah. So I would say I would challenge that. They're in opposition in a very like conventional sense. Like, I think it's true that these outlets, and I know a lot of people in Blue Sky, for example, might disagree with this. But most of the outlets you mentioned, I would say, are conventionally liberal and uh, Democrat leaning in their political orientation. However, I do think that even now they're covering Trump like they would an ordinary Republican president. Um, you know, not even quite even reaching the pitch of like a Nixon coverage kind of thing. Um, and I actually think it's more so this time around than in the first the first term with Trump. I think outlets actually were a bit more openly adversarial, like the New York Times itself specifically, as well as the Washington Post, were
Democracy dies
much
in
more right,
darkness
right,
was
which
the
they tried to
change the
get rid
first
of this
time.
time, and then stopped with the backlash. But um, no, they actually like first of all they just saw that it was good business. Um, they got a ton of subscribers in 2017, and so they said, all right, we will take that tone a little bit more. But this time around, they seem to have decided. Well, in the New York Times case, they seem to have decided, no, we need to somehow go back in time 40 years to when there was more of a bipartisan readership structure for mainstream media, which is not going to happen. In the case of the Washington Post, uh, Bezos just 100% is one of the billionaires who has decided he has other businesses that are exposed to the Trump administration, and he needs to use the Washington Post as sort of a way to appease him. Now that hasn't extended to the reporting in either cases. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post do incredible, valuable reporting on the Trump administration to this day. Some that is not done anywhere else. Um, but the unfortunate reality is reporting is valuable for you or me, in terms of trying to understand what's going on and try to devise strategies. But in the way that I mean that opposition media is valuable, it's actually not that valuable. It can be valuable in some cases. Some reporting can trigger a genuine media event that focuses on the story that's produced. The vast majority does not, however, and you don't necessarily need reporting to get that. Um, so when it comes to opposition media, the main thing that has been on my mind lately is a work um, by a political scientist named Singh. I'm looking up his power. His first name rather. It is um, Nanihal Singh, political scientist, and his work is on coups specifically. Um, but what he found was that what mattered for a coup was not who had the most military power, but who could convince enough people that the coup had support. And the main tool for doing that was broadcast, because a broadcast is something that everyone hears, everyone knows that everyone hears, and therefore it sort of creates this publicly known fact. So media of various kinds broadcast most potently, but obviously broadcast doesn't matter as much in the United States as it used to. Um, Media can create perceptions of reality. And even if you have a majority of people in this country, or even a majority of people in government institutions in the military who oppose authoritarianism personally, unless they believe that everyone else also, unless they're aware that they're in the majority, they can actually believe that they're in a minority and that they don't have enough backing to take action. So for me, the important thing about it in opposition media is consolidating this sense of mutual expectation that we all are aware that we exist, much like the hands-off protests this past Saturday. I think were valuable not because the Trump administration is going to go, "Uh-oh, there's a bunch of people protesting me. I'm going to stop doing what I'm doing," but it's just valuable to see, hey, there's hundreds of thousands of people. These are huge crowds of people. I'm not alone. There's lots of people who feel even more strongly than me if I didn't turn out, like not only do I disagree with it, but there's people who disagree with it so much that they took time out of their day to go and walk in a huge crowd of other people um in the rain potentially. Um so it's that constantly creating a sense, to use a moralistic term, you could call it solidarity. Um um, I think that can be a loaded term that means more than one thing, but it just in a very minimal sense, it means we recognize that there are other people like us, and there are enough of us to matter, to make a difference. So that to me, that's the key thing within opposition media. It's not just good reporting, which I 100% believe that the Post and the New York Times and places like that still do. Um, but the headlines are always very moderated. The framing is always very moderated. They still kind of treat Trump as if he's just another normal Republican. And maybe they don't like Republicans or don't love Republicans, but they consider that that's just ordinary Democratic politics to have Republican presidents sometimes. Whereas I think it's just important to hammer in the truth that this is not normal. We are in an emergency situation where things are escalating very quickly, um, and we need to say, "Hey, there's a lot of people who don't want this to happen and will do things, do whatever they can, however minimal, to stop it from happening." And your point is taken that just talking to the people in your life or, you know, paying the talking points memo or something, money is a very small thing, individually. I also think this is a time to be doing more of that than you might normally. I've certainly subscribing to more than I used to. I'm talking to more people in my life than I would have usually, you know, in family gatherings or something, or some friendships formed through previous work experience or something. I don't talk politics with them, but nowadays I do. Nowadays I certainly do.
I'm glad you mentioned solidarity because as you're talking about the role of opposition media, it sounds like it's not necessarily about persuasion. And so I read and happily subscribe to Liberal Currents, and I encourage all of my listeners to do so because it's an absolutely vital publication right now. Support Adam's work and everyone else who's part of it. But I read it, Liberal Currents is not persuading me, right? Like it's informing me. I'm learning a lot. There are multiple articles that you have published that have updated my thinking on important stuff. I've stolen many of your authors as podcast guests, but it's not like it's changing my views of the Trump administration, because I'm already share the views. Um, and and similar with lots of these publications. And so what I wonder about is the role of media, particularly smaller opposition media, and solidarity in such a fractured media environment, because the people who pay you $5 a month or whatever for liberal currents are unlikely to be people who disagree with the editorial line of liberal currents, or people
Yeah.
who are in favor of the Trump administration, or people who think actually Doge is a libertarian project, or whatever it happens to be, right?
Right.
They're probably not subscribing. And so what is the solidarity simply that liberal currents exists? Me knowing it exists means that I know there are people out there who have the kinds of views expressed at liberal currents. And then the more people who send you $5 a month to pay for more writers and more content, the more liberal currents exists as a signal to people of that solidarity. Like, is that the role? Because it's not cutting across this fractured bubbles.
Yeah. So there's two things I think. The persuasion component is sort of like a within coalition thing. So one thing that I try to do is use political science or like knowledge of how specific institutions or laws work to say, hey, here. Well, so first of all, in December, what I did is I said, hey, there's this whole political science literature on personalist dictators, like one dictator is not the same as another dictator. There's many different kinds. This is the specific kind that Donald Trump is trying to be, and this is what we can expect from him. And that's sort of like an informing, as you said, but also it's a persuading, because you could say, no, he's totalitarian or he's this or that. Like there's a debate to be had there, maybe. But just giving someone something that specific. I also like just saying, here's an angle of attack. So for the big law firms, I just churned out a quick piece and said, state bar associations have the power to say, hey, as part of your oath that you took to get to pass the bar, once you pass the bar, um, upholding the Constitution is part of it, say. And we are now taking the stance that if you simply go along with these executive orders, you are not fulfilling your oath and we will disbar you. Do I think that's going to happen? No. But what I want to do is find as many levers as I can institutionally that exist and put them in readers' hands so that if someone is in a position to actually influence an outcome like that, that they can. So I do want to do that. That is semi persuasion, because we have some law people in the liberal currents community, and they would not have thought to do that, frankly, and they find the idea a little bit shocking, but also like they understand the stakes and they say, well, yeah, if we could get them to do that, they should. The other side of it, though, is what you're talking about, which is, it's being a rallying point of, um, it's just funny what happens with publications, right? There's some people who follow a publication, and being a reader of that publication sort of becomes part of their identity, and it becomes part of how they relate to other people. So if a bunch of people are liberal currents readers and they know, and like, you're talking to someone, you learn they are one too, then you feel you have like a connection, and maybe you're participating in our Discord, like you said, or maybe you're just one of the readers who reads it for free. Um, but that it's part of the glue, and again, it's a small glue, like you said, we're just a small publication, but it becomes part of the glue of a larger coalition, which needs in a fractious environment, as you said, lots of different things to act as glue for the whole thing to come together. um, but just pushing hard to have that sense that we are a coalition, we are a community that stands together in opposition, not just individuals who don't like what's going on.
No, I like that point. It made me think of, I think there's a book by Michael Azerrad about the history of indie rock called Our Band Could Be Your Life. And it's like forming your identity around these coalitions or these publications, or internalizing them, strengthens it.
It's not like I would always recommend that, in normal times to do for your politics or whatever. People do it and it's fine. Just that I'm not against it, but it's not like I would recommend it for anyone. I think if ever there was a time to do it, though, it's now. I'm not just saying that self-interestedly either. There's other great publications you could do this for, like The Unpopulist. But yeah, I mean, it's the first thing that every authoritarian tries to do, every single one, is to find a way to suppress opposition media. It's absolutely the first thing on every one of their list. They try and take over, they try and command some huge state media apparatus. Often it's already created because many countries have like a state broadcast that they can simply take over and run, on a partisan basis. But other times they shutter some, they buy some, they nationalize some, and they suppress others. Um, and, even in China, for example, you can insult the Chinese government on the internet. You absolutely can. You can say they're a piece of, whatever. But, um, but if you say something that looks like it has the potential to turn into collective action, that's when they come and arrest you. Um, so there's actually freedom to criticize the Chinese government to, on the internet. They have internet access, they can say mean things about the Chinese government. But if the substance of it is said, or the audience for it is such that they feel it actually leads to collective action in some way, that then they will come down on you real hard, real hard. So they're particular about what they go after, and that it's exactly that kind of thing that we need to be promoting to a maximal extent. That collective sense of being able to act together.
You mentioned reading a bunch of political science on authoritarian regimes and democratic backsliding and related topics and writing from that perspective. And I wanted to talk about that because that's one of the things that also stands out in what you're doing is we have a lot of people writing. What you're doing is not hard reporting. You're not the It's not just like standard traditional journalism. It falls within the commentary and opinion and analysis mode. And a lot of people are writing that, but a lot of people are basically spitballing it off of, their sense, their impressions. Many of them have a deep body of knowledge, but they're often writing outside of their wheelhouse. I remember one particularly successful pundit, I think, made a remark at one point that his comparative advantage in writing political commentary was he could read Wikipedia pages faster than anyone else. And and so, can you speak to the value of, call it, just academic ideas and research, like the hardcore of research and knowledge, the kind of
Yeah.
books that cost $180 and are only available at university libraries and are really challenging to read in this moment and informing these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's kind of a hard time to start doing it. So I'll just give you how it worked for me. As you know, I was a master's in economics. So that, you know, give me some background, but not really. Trump administration happens in 2017. We start liberal currents, and at that time, it was mostly a political philosophy focus because that's where our strength was. We'd read a lot of like Jacob Levy stuff and things like that, Charles Taylor. Um, uh, but I was following the news. I was concerned about where things were going, and what I found was that my basic knowledge of even just how our system works was very lacking. And what would happen would be you'd get a news report of something outrageous, and then you get a follow-up report about, well, actually, that's not that different from what had been happening, in the previous administration or the administration before that. It's very continuous. And I'm not saying that those follow-ups were always correct. Often, many times they were, though. Um, what I am saying is that I didn't feel capable of evaluating those claims and really understanding what was distinctly bad and what was continuous with some bad things about our system overall. Um, and so I started then to do this reading on the political science of the American system, the comparative. You can't really understand your system unless you understand the alternatives. And then finally reading about non-democratic systems, very alternative, right? And I didn't really feel like I understood democracy concretely until I started reading about non-democracies, to be frank. Um, so I did this. Trump lost in 2020. I continued doing it anyway. And unfortunately, it put me in a position to be prepared this time around to speak a little more concretely. I'd already started writing more concretely in the interim. But essentially, say halfway into last year, there just came a moment where it became clear there was high odds that he was going to win again. Um, and most of our writing became dedicated to trying to explain the stakes. And then once he won, trying to explain what we can do and what can be done, not even just what we can do, us, you and me, but what can be done. For example, I wrote about what Democratic leaders in blue states could do, but also what we should expect, how it's going to work, what Trump can do, what he can't do, what's a warning sign that things are consolidating, what's a promising sign that he's meeting resistance, um, and yeah, I would say for both basic academic knowledge and hard reporting, which, as you say, we do not do. Both of those involve a set of skills that are very costly and, in my opinion, extremely undervalued, unfortunately. I personally rely heavily on both of them. I rely on reporters, I rely on academics, and I am neither. So, I'm a bit parasitic on both. And it is one of the very shocking things about the past 3 months is the rapid pace which the Trump administration has moved to just completely destroy our system of higher education. Um, that we rely on, and again, also acting to try and suppress reporting, and outlets that report on him. Yeah, but I mean, those are key things for that undergird our ability to really speak to what's going on.
So you spoke to one reason why there aren't more writers writing about this moment who are deeply into the empirical and comparative and academic side of the questions that are much more live right now than they have been in any of our lifetimes. And that's just it's a lot of work,
Yeah,
and you've got other things to
it
do,
takes
and
time. Yeah.
yeah. But it does also seem like we have a moment, and this predates the current run through the academic institutions that they're attempting, of real skepticism of exactly the kind
Yeah.
of ideas, books, scholars, publications that you're talking about, that either folk wisdom is good enough, or superficial understanding, the I read the Wikipedia pages, is good enough, or that all those people whose very expensive books you're reading, Adam, are part of the problem. That they're misleading, they're hiding the real evidence, they're not sufficiently heterodox, and so on. What do you think is going on there? Because I think you're right that getting this right really matters. Knowing what's happening, what has happened in other places, what the response has been, what's worked, what hasn't, what the warning signs are, what the optimistic signs are, is critical to strategic and tactically responding appropriately in this moment. But there's a lot of skepticism of that kind of knowledge.
Yeah. Um, I don't know that it's any one thing. It's a pretty global trend, this, like, bleeding of trust in institutions. Um, I don't I people have put it more thoughtfully or poetically than I could, talking about there were sort of almost utopian dreams, not even just the Marxist ones, but in the 20th century and the 19th century. And the reality turned out to be more prosaic. Like, we've gotten a lot richer. We have. We've learned a lot more things. Um, but it never ends. Like, it's always incomplete. Um, a lot of times we backtrack because it turns out, or we don't really backtrack, but the progress takes the form of learning that a lot of assumptions we had were just wrong. And then it feels like we've lost ground rather than gained it. When in reality, we've gained ground. We've gained the insight that that stuff is wrong, right? But it might not feel that way. Um, there's status things as well, which you can't discount. It's a high status thing to be a tenured professor or a tenure track professor, which very few people can aspire to be, but many try. Um, and many embittered people that write online are people who either tried and burned out because it's a brutal system, which I won't discount. Like, I have friends that are, in fact, some editors of Liberal Currents are adjunct professors. It's an extremely exploitative system, in terms of how that works. Um, it's easy to see how one could become bitter. The general population, I think, just becomes suspicious because I mean, there's a reflexive anti-authoritarianism, which I understand. Anti-authoritarianism in the sense of they don't like someone saying I'm an authority on a topic and you're not, and you should listen to me and not just your gut judgment. A lot of people want to say, "Well, who the hell are you?" And I understand that, but at the end of the day, these are complicated topics. And what I try to tell to people, but it's a difficult message to swallow, is it's not that there's something special about a scholar on a topic compared to you. They're not smarter than you or better than you. They've just spent more time on something than you have. And even if even if the consensus or the range of acceptable positions within a field is turns out to be mostly wrong now, the fact of the matter is that those people have all thought of every question you would have thought to ask and discussed it at length. Because any obvious question you can think to ask is something that someone has already thought of, if it's obvious. Um, Often outsider feedback is helpful in things, but the basic core of a conversational community of scholars who have thought about this for a long time and across generations um, is valuable. And uh, people, I don't know, people just think they're putting on airs, or they think that it's not even that it's deceptive, but it's sort of a way to smuggle in a way to rule their lives by using that authoritative knowledge to turn into more institutional authority, which is not wrong, right? I mean, in a sense, doctors have a lot of power, famously. A doctor could ruin your life if they truly wanted to, in some circumstances. For example, if they see the way that you are with your kid and they decide there's something funny going on here just based on their gut, if they really run with that, they can really ruin your life. I mean, they can make your life difficult. But there's a reason we do that, right? I mean, and the reasons are good reasons. It results in some bad situations too, because any situation where you create authority, institutional authority, you also create abuse because it's just going to happen, or even mistakes that ruin people's lives, or hurt people in maybe less severely than that. So, part of it I think is just we have now 100 years or more of experience of modern big institutions, um, and there's some disenchantment with them. And part of that is because at the end of the day, institutions are just people. Even the smartest, most capable people are still just people. They could be capable, but do corrupt or bad things. They could be moral, but make a mistake. They're just people, and that reality of just people. The simple reality of just people is harder for some people to swallow than I think a more nefarious narrative, maybe.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to note for listeners because this the question of like the expertise of experts and should we trust experts, and what role does scholarly and expert style knowledge play is a really important one. And I think that the point you made is worth highlighting of if you hear a set of ideas that you don't have deep familiarity with and you think of, well, here's an obvious objection that destroys their position. You've almost certainly not understood, or you're missing something, or because if it's obvious to you without that knowledge, they've thought of it and they have a response to it. And I think the way that so I would get this when I was back doing more like policy analyst kind of stuff. Um, the frustration you'd have with people who would like object to you because you were a policy analyst from a particular perspective and you'd be pointing out like this is the way policy works in this area, and they'd be like, well, you're a libertarian or you're a progressive, or so I don't believe you. And it was like, well, actually all the other people across the spectrum know how works too, like because it's just like basic policy expertise. And then there are meaningful disagreements, but it's not about this is actually like a pretty settled matter that no one really disputes. And I think the way that experts actually go wrong, it's rarely the case that like the non-expert comes along and shows them up.
Right.
It is much more they're shown up by other experts from other disciplines. That when I notice it, it is the political philosophers are writing all of this stuff and writing out their theories of how the state should work, but the political scientist has data about like actually it doesn't quite work that way, guys. Um, or or the economists are unaware of what sociologists know about how humans respond to, or the political scientists don't know what the political psychologists do. And so it's more of a siloing among experts that I think leads them often astray. Or in the government, it's that everybody I work with at this agency is an expert in this way. And so what we see as the most pressing things within our area of expertise are the most pressing things. And you can't think in terms of trade-offs because you're not aware of what you're trading off against.
Yeah, at the end of the day, there's no expert in trade-offs, right? Like that there's values are values. And I think that maybe that is another area where you could say that to extend your point. Another thing that may disenchant people is frequently people who become experts on a topic also think that they're an experts on what the correct trade-off
Mhm.
balance should be, which they certainly can make a better informed choice, but that doesn't necessarily mean that anyone else with the same information would make that choice. Um, so that's another thing. You're deciding on behalf of a lot of other people who don't have the tools to make the decision themselves, but might resent you for making it on their behalf.
Yes. I wanted to ask about a theme that I see at liberal currents that I admire is the deep analysis with culture and cultural history that shows up. So a point, just Samantha Hancock's Lee is very good at this, but this seems to be something that is often missing from a lot of the political discussions of like, how did we get here? And what is Trumpism as a movement? And
Yeah.
the the simple version of it is everybody thinks it's like Trumpism was just about the price of eggs, or the first time around it was economic anxiety was driving it. And so it was very much this kind of, we still analyze things in terms of, I guess, either it's about economic structure and incentives, or it's about just kind of reading the tea leaves of polling data without really getting into like the narrative behind that or
Yeah.
the comprehensive belief systems. Can you speak to the role of basically cultural social analysis in kind of understanding this moment compared to like the standard ways that journalists, policy analysts, and so on think about political questions?
Yeah, it's hard, I think, because it's slippery. Um, and, I'm probably not the best person to talk about it on the liberal current side because it's rarely what I write about in particular, or even what I edit. Um, so like Alan Elrod is another one who's been writing a lot for us. He writes for other places as well. But he's been writing a lot along these lines for us. When you were talking about solidarity, I was thinking of something he wrote for us recently about just this feeling that everything has gone nuts. But the way that it's gone nuts is that the people who feel that way are told that it's not. Like, empirically, all this stuff is going on, but everyone else is saying to us, you're just overreacting. And it was one thing when they said that in Trump's first term, even though Trump was kind of outrageous then, but to continue to say it now just feels like, what are you, what he, so he's talking about, he sort of took a cultural angle on that as well. Um, and people, what I found interesting was a lot of the responses to that were thank you. They were thanking, they like personally thanked him for saying that. Like it was this affirmation of, yes, that's exactly what's going on. Um, because it's more, yeah, it's more than just, I like I said, I focus a lot on just sort of the institutional nuts and bolts on how this stuff happens, but it's more than that. How does someone like Trump even get to those levers? Um, and the way he gets there is he's got this hardcore of support. It's not a majority. It's not even a majority of Republicans, though they all love him now. But really, it's like the 30% or so of the country, which is a large percent of Republican voters, um, who will just follow him off a cliff if he asks them to. Um, and I don't think you can understand that without looking at it culturally. And Alan looks at it from a few perspectives. He comes from, uh, an evangelical Christian background, um, so he has sort of an angle on that. He also looks at the history of fascism, um, and the cultural elements there. Samantha tends to look at gender, but not like when people hear that they think, "Well, we're just doing Judith Butler here," but Not that there's anything wrong with that. We've published that as well. But no, more like there's anxiety about the fact that in the modern world, women are not dependent on men for their livelihoods, and often it's the women actually who are getting work, not the men, in at least in some circumstances and communities. Um, and how do we think about relations between them in given that reality? What's the new what what's what's the new normal going to be? And she very much believes, and I agree with her, that we actually haven't settled what the basic approach of the modern world is. Now that we're all rich, and increasingly the rest of the world is too. Um, Now that we can go and just make a livelihood on our own, and we don't necessarily need to get married in order to just survive, have a household that survives. It's a personal choice to get married. It's a personal choice to have kids. Um, no one has to do it. It's not even even the social expectation is relaxing to some extent. That creates a tremendous amount of anxiety, um, from people who thought that just having a wife and a kid was their God-given right. And that was just the natural order of things. It was like the great chain of being, and your position on the chain was the paterfamilias, or whatever. Um, I do think it is important. I don't think you can understand how we got there without it. How how is it that we had an incredible economic boom, which had higher inflation than we had, pretty much in my lifetime, but the inflation was going down, and we were getting a soft landing, a soft landing of the kind that I'd never seen before in my life. I don't know in the history of the Fed that we have had as many a soft landing quite as good as this one had been. Um, how is it that we get that, and yet Donald Trump gets a majority, all the popular vote, practically a majority of voters, um, as if they're pissed off about how things are. I don't think you can explain that without some cultural elements. I mean, his first term campaign in 2016 was ugly, but I've never seen anything like his 2024 campaign. That was so hideous what they did. Um, so I don't know how you run that campaign and you win 77 million votes, or whatever it ended up being. Um, there's something going on there, and it's not material based.
To close, then, given the work that you've been doing, the reading you've done, the analysis that you've written, what do you see as, and I could ask what you see as like the most immediate threats or the biggest red flags institutionally, constitutionally, etc. What we've talked about, and I think most of the listeners are aware of a lot of that, and they share our sense of alarm. So, do you see any signs of hope, optimism, the possibility that, unlike the experience of other countries that we watch democratic backslide into authoritarianism, we might actually get out of this and get out of it, in our lifetimes or hopefully even sooner than that?
Yeah, I think just the basic fundamentals make consolidation more difficult for Trump than for other figures. Orban, who a lot of people talk about, Orban went into office with a huge supermajority win of the votes in a free and fair election, but he was extremely popular. His party was very popular. They were so popular that they could mint new changes to their constitution with just their party, and they did. Um, they were also a unicameral parliament. Um, so our system, Trump was not popular. It was a very narrow win. He's not exactly a beloved figure. Even when he had a high approval rating, it was never higher. Rather, it was never high. It never reached like what Barack Obama had at his peak, for example, or even like on a bad day. Um, and We do not have a unicameral parliament, to say the least, um, and we do not have a unitary system. Our federalist system, for all its problems, means that consolidating federal control over all the different governing bodies is a tremendous challenge. The fact of the matter is that the federal government relies on state governments and local governments for the implementation of federal law. And if they piss off the states enough by being too heavy-handed, they can simply stop implementing things that the federal government wants them to implement. Um, they have a lot of leverage they can use and have not, because I think they're a little nervous too. But even if they don't, I just don't see a path where Trump consolidates federal control over the deep blue states or even the purple ones. Um, one area for hope too is the Virginia elections that are happening this year. Extremely high odds that they're going to flip back blue. And as we know, when Virginia Democrats are in charge, they are no joke. They're serious. They're implement like many purple states. Once the Democrats actually get in, they implement a Democratic agenda, and they appear aggressive just because they've been out of office for a while, and it's their opportunity to do so. So that will be another area where he's going to lose some influence over, hopefully. Elections are administered very locally, which again makes it hard to make them unfree, and unfair in a uniform way. Obviously, red states have been playing this game for a long time, not just red states. New York also doesn't have the greatest better now than it used to be, but um, point is, in 2 years and in 4 years, I don't like the idea that he's going to move elections to be as unfair as Orban could do, say, or Putin. Um, Unlikely, I think. So there's a lot of things that are just baseline against him. And then meanwhile, he's just done a ton of things to make himself unpopular very quickly. So whatever popularity he had in November, he's pissing it away very quickly. And that makes mobilizing opposition easier, especially if he's doing it before he's consolidated. It's one thing to do unpopular things in 2 years or 3 years after he spent the time to seize control of the executive branch. But seizing control of the executive branch takes time. It happens slower than Elon Musk can take over a computer system, for example. Um, so the idea that he's going to consolidate when before he's even consolidated, he's pissing off many of his own support bases, with the things he's doing, it's tenuous. I think the most likely scenario for all of us, and I'm not saying it's the one that's going to happen, is he's going to do a ton of damage. He's already done a ton of damage. And it's going to be a very tall order to fix it. But I don't think we're going to be stuck with him. I don't think that's going to happen.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Reimagining Liberty. If you'd like to listen to future episodes free of ads and sponsorships, you can become a supporter for just a few dollars a month. Head to www.aaronrosspowell.com to learn more.